In 1834, Constance Sullivan stood in her farmhouse kitchen, the smell of fresh bread masking the stench that rose from the basement beneath her feet. Below her, 47 children sat chained in darkness, some so young they had forgotten their own names. For 23 years, she had perfected the art of wearing compassion like a costume while collecting children the way others collected livestock. What the good people of Millbrook, Virginia didn't know was that their most charitable neighbor was running one of history's most horrific child trafficking operations, and the basement where she kept them would remain hidden until a winter so brutal it cracked the foundation of her perfect lie. This is the story of how a woman convinced an entire community she was saving children while she was destroying them. How a single act of neighborly concern unraveled 2 decades of systematic horror. And how the sins of Constance and Ezra Sullivan would force America to confront a darkness it had refused to see. The Virginia countryside in 1834 existed in a strange space between worlds. The old plantation system still dominated. Tobacco fields stretched across gentle hills, and most families lived the way their grandparents had lived. Millbrook was a cluster of 50 farming families spread across Henrico County, connected by dusty roads and shared routines. Everyone knew everyone, or thought they did. The Sullivan farm sat on the outskirts, 200 acres of prime land surrounding a white clapboard farmhouse that looked like every other respectable home in Virginia. Ezra Sullivan had bought the property in 1809 with tobacco money inherited from his father. He was unremarkable in every way that mattered to his neighbors. Quiet, hard-working, punctual at church when he attended. His wife Constance arrived 2 years later as a bride of 22. She was the one people remembered. Dark-haired, soft-voiced, impeccably dressed in the simple style that suggested both modesty and means. She attended Methodist services when her health permitted. She contributed to community causes, and she had a story that satisfied every question before it could fully form. She and Ezra were caring for orphaned children from her family back in Pennsylvania. Temporary arrangements, she explained, just until permanent homes could be found. The children were traumatized, shy, still grieving their parents. They needed time, they needed patience, they needed privacy. The community, familiar with the cruelty of mortality rates in 1830s America, accepted this without question. Orphaned children were a tragedy everyone understood, and the Sullivans were doing God's work by taking them in. Mrs. Henderson at the general store would sometimes glimpse a small face peering from the Sullivan wagon when Constance came to town. The children never spoke. Their eyes never quite met hers, but Constance's explanation was always ready, always reasonable. They were adjusting, they were healing, they needed more time. Thomas Henderson, who ran the store, later recalled that Constance Sullivan was one of his most reliable customers. Every 2 weeks she arrived with a detailed list and enough cash to purchase quantities that seemed large for a couple without children of their own. Flour, cornmeal, salt pork, molasses. Basic medicine in unusual amounts. When he mentioned the quantities, Constance would smile that soft smile and remind him about the orphans. Children from poor circumstances, she explained, often arrived with ailments that required treatment. The explanation always satisfied him. What Thomas Henderson didn't calculate was that the amounts Constance purchased could feed not 5 or 6 children, but dozens. What he didn't notice was that she never varied her purchases based on season, never adjusted for children supposedly being placed with permanent families, never reduced the quantities even as years passed, and those same temporary orphans should have moved on. The Sullivan farm operated on a schedule that puzzled some neighbors. Most farming families rose with the sun and retired at dusk, but lights burned in the Sullivan windows at odd hours. The sound of construction work echoed across the fields late into the night. When asked, Ezra explained he was making improvements to accommodate the growing number of children in their care. The basement was his project. Local craftsmen remembered being hired throughout the 1810s and 1820s for excavation work. They dug, they hauled stone, they installed support beams, but no one ever saw the finished work because Ezra paid them well in cash and asked only that they focus on their assigned sections rather than the overall project. The men took their money and asked no questions. In an economy where cash was scarce, you didn't interrogate a customer who paid on time. What they were building was a prison that extended far beyond the footprint of the house above, a maze of chambers connected by narrow passages, rooms with walls 2 feet thick, doors that locked from the outside, chains bolted directly into bedrock. Dr. Marcus Whitfield, the traveling physician who served Millbrook, was called to the Sullivan farm several times during the 1820s and early 1830s. Each time he was told that one of the orphan children had fallen ill and needed medical attention, but Dr. Whitfield was never permitted to examine his patients directly. Constance would describe symptoms and request specific medications. When he insisted on seeing the children, she would explain that they were too frightened of strangers, too traumatized by the loss of their parents to allow examination by unfamiliar men. The doctor, a kind man who had treated traumatized children before, accepted this explanation. He prescribed medicines based on Constance's descriptions. He collected his fees. He left. Years later, when he understood what his compliance had enabled, Dr. Whitfield would dedicate the rest of his life to child welfare. But in the moment, faced with a respectable woman in a respectable home making reasonable requests, he saw no reason to question. Even the local pastor believed in the Sullivan family's charitable work. Reverend Samuel Matthews visited the farm occasionally, praising Constance and Ezra for their Christian compassion. He offered to help find permanent homes for the orphans. Constance assured him she was already in correspondence with relatives in Pennsylvania who would eventually take the children. The process simply required patience. If you're watching this because stories of hidden evil fascinate you, then you understand why we can't look away from cases like this. Subscribe to this channel, because what's coming will challenge everything you thought you knew about how monsters hide in plain sight. The Sullivan story is just beginning, and what happened in that basement will haunt you long after this video ends. The deception was so complete that not a single person in Millbrook suspected the truth. Constance Sullivan had perfected something far more dangerous than violence. She had perfected the appearance of virtue. And beneath that appearance, in chambers dug deep into Virginia clay, children from 6 states were learning that screaming accomplished nothing when no one believed you could be there at all. Rebecca was 7 years old when she disappeared from a market in Baltimore in 1821. Her mother turned away for 30 seconds to examine fabric at a merchant's stall. When she looked back, Rebecca was gone. The mother searched until her voice gave out. The City Watch investigated for 3 days. Then the case joined thousands of others in the grim category of children who simply vanished. Rebecca didn't vanish. She was in a wagon, gagged and hidden beneath burlap sacks, traveling south through Maryland into Virginia. The woman driving the wagon had kind eyes and a soft voice. She told Rebecca that her mother had sent her to fetch the girl, that there had been an accident, that everything would be explained when they arrived. Rebecca believed her. Children did. By the time Rebecca understood she had been lied to, she was standing in a basement room lit by a single oil lamp. The kind-eyed woman was attaching an iron cuff to her ankle, the chain connected to a bolt in the stone wall, and the woman was explaining the rules in that same soft voice. You will work. You will obey. You will be silent. If you follow these rules, you will be fed and clothed. If you break them, you will learn what suffering means. Rebecca was the 41st child in Constance Sullivan's collection. The operation had started small. In 1811, shortly after Constance married Ezra and moved to Virginia, she traveled back to Pennsylvania to visit her family. She returned with 2 children, explaining they were orphaned cousins. The children were real orphans, taken from an institution where Constance had connections. She had forged the necessary papers. The institution's administrator had been paid to falsify records. The children worked the Sullivan farm. They slept in the basement. They never went to town. When they grew too old or too rebellious to manage, they disappeared. Constance would explain to neighbors that the children had been placed with relatives in Pennsylvania. In truth, they had been sold to labor contractors who asked no questions about provenance. By 1815, Constance had refined her system. She established contacts in multiple cities: Baltimore, Philadelphia, Richmond, Charleston, people who could acquire children through various means, orphanages with corrupt administrators, poorhouses with lax record-keeping, markets and streets where unsupervised children could be snatched in moments of parental distraction. Some children were purchased. Some were stolen. Some were surrendered by families so desperately poor they believed their children would have better lives elsewhere. None of them did. The basement expanded as the operation grew. By 1820, there were separate chambers for different age groups: older children who could work in the fields, younger children who performed domestic labor, infants and toddlers who would be raised until they were old enough to be useful or sold. The children rarely saw sunlight. They worked before dawn and after dusk when neighbors were unlikely to notice. They moved between basement and fields through a covered passage Ezra had constructed. From the road, from any neighboring property, the Sullivan farm looked like exactly what it pretended to be, a modest agricultural operation run by a charitable couple. Inside the basement, children learned to move silently, to work without complaint, to understand that the woman they called Mother Sullivan was both their provider and their tormentor. She could be kind when they obeyed. She brought medicine when they were sick. She made sure they had enough food to work. But when they disobeyed, when they cried too loudly or worked too slowly or showed any sign of rebellion, Mother Sullivan became something else entirely. The punishment room was 8 feet square, with a ceiling so low an adult couldn't stand upright. No windows, no light except what leaked under the door. Children were locked inside for days, sometimes alone, sometimes in groups, their bodies pressed together in darkness so absolute they couldn't see their own hands. Rebecca spent 4 days in that room when she was 8 years old. Her crime was crying for her mother. When she emerged, she never cried again where anyone could hear her. The children developed their own society in the darkness. The older ones protected the younger when they could. They shared food with those too small or weak to work as hard. They whispered stories to each other in the few hours between work and sleep, trying to remember what the world had been like before the basement. Some forgot their original names. Some forgot what their parents looked like. One girl, taken at age 4, eventually forgot she had ever lived anywhere else. Constance kept meticulous records. Her ledger hidden in a compartment beneath the kitchen floorboards documented every child. Date acquired, cost if purchased, age, assigned work duties, disposition when they left the operation. The ledger read like an inventory of merchandise because that's what the children were to her. Assets, investments, property that generated profit through labor or sale. The profits were substantial. The children's work eliminated the need to hire farm laborers. Their sale to labor contractors, particularly as they reached adolescence and could perform harder work, brought cash that Ezra invested in legitimate businesses. The Sullivan farm, by 1830, was one of the more prosperous operations in Henrico County, all of it built on the backs of children who couldn't scream loud enough for anyone to hear. February 1834 arrived with cold that cracked trees and froze wells solid. The temperature dropped below freezing and stayed there for weeks. Inside the Sullivan basement, children huddled together for warmth, their breath visible in the lamplight. The cold was brutal, but it was the foundation that mattered. The house was built in 1810. The basement had been excavated and expanded throughout the following decade, but neither Ezra Sullivan nor his hired craftsmen had properly accounted for the way Virginia clay shifts when it freezes. On February 7th, William Hutchinson, whose farm bordered the Sullivan property, heard something crack in the night. He stood on his porch in the pre-dawn darkness, listening. The sound had been loud enough to wake him, loud enough to carry across frozen fields. He waited, heard nothing more, and went back to bed. The next morning, examining his own foundation for damage, Hutchinson noticed something odd about the Sullivan property. A section of ground near the farmhouse had collapsed inward, leaving a depression roughly 6 feet across. Not unusual for severe freezes, but what was unusual was the dark opening visible at the bottom of the depression. Hutchinson mentioned it to his wife over breakfast. She suggested he tell the Sullivans so they could repair whatever drainage issue had caused the collapse. Hutchinson decided to ride over that afternoon. He found Ezra Sullivan near the barn, looking exhausted. Ezra thanked him for the information, explained that the freeze had indeed caused some foundation issues, and assured Hutchinson he would address it immediately. The conversation was brief, polite, entirely unremarkable, except for one detail that Hutchinson mentioned later to his wife. While they were talking, Ezra kept glancing back at the house, and from somewhere inside, very faint, Hutchinson thought he heard children singing. It was a strange thing to remember, but it stuck with him because the sound wasn't joyful. It was mechanical, rhythmic, like a chant more than a song. Hutchinson didn't think much about it at the time, but he mentioned it to Thomas Henderson at the general store 3 days later. Henderson, who had been serving the Sullivans for over 2 decades, mentioned something that had been bothering him. The amount of food Constance purchased had never varied. Not once in 23 years. Not even when she claimed children had been placed with families and left the farm. The quantities stayed exactly the same. Henderson and Hutchinson talked for 20 minutes. By the end of the conversation, both men felt an uncomfortable suspicion forming, a suspicion neither wanted to voice because it seemed insane to suspect Constance and Ezra Sullivan, of all people, of anything sinister, but the suspicion grew. Hutchinson went to Sheriff Benjamin Crawford with what he knew. It wasn't much. A collapsed section of ground, strange singing, unchanging food purchases. Crawford, a methodical man who had served as sheriff for 15 years, made notes and promised to look into it. He rode to the Sullivan farm 2 days later. Constance welcomed him with her usual gracious warmth. She offered coffee. She explained that the foundation damage had been repaired. She showed him around the property, pointing out various improvements Ezra had made over the years. Everything appeared normal. Everything felt wrong. Crawford couldn't articulate why. He was a lawman who believed in evidence, and he had none. But his instincts, honed by years of investigating crimes, told him something was hidden here. He asked to see the basement. Constance hesitated for the first time, just a fraction of a second. Then she smiled and explained that the basement was full of stored goods and quite cluttered, perhaps another time when they'd had a chance to organize things better. Crawford pressed. Constance's smile remained fixed, but her eyes changed. She asked if the sheriff had a warrant. She asked what exactly he suspected her of. She reminded him that she and Ezra were respected members of the community who had dedicated years to charitable work. Crawford had no warrant. He had no specific accusation. He thanked her for the coffee and left, but he didn't stop investigating. That revelation should be making your blood run cold right now. Hit that like button if you understand where this is heading, because what Sheriff Crawford found next would expose one of the most systematic horror operations in American history. This story is far from over. Crawford spent the next week gathering information. He talked to Dr. Whitfield about his visits to the Sullivan farm. He reviewed records at Henderson's store. He spoke with the craftsman who had worked on the basement expansion years earlier. He investigated property records and tax documents. A pattern emerged. The Sullivans owned far more property than their farm income could justify. They paid in cash for everything. They had no visible debt. And despite claiming to care for orphaned children temporarily, there was no record of any child ever being officially placed with them or leaving through documented channels. Crawford also learned something else. In 1832, a girl named Rebecca had been taken from the Sullivan property by child welfare officials following an anonymous complaint. The complaint claimed a child was being held against her will. When officials investigated, they found Rebecca, who was then 18, working in the Sullivan household. She appeared healthy but refused to speak. Constance explained that Rebecca was mentally impaired, unable to communicate properly, and under their care as part of their charitable work with special needs children. The officials, satisfied by Constance's explanations and Rebecca's apparent physical health, left her in the Sullivans' custody. What they didn't know was that Rebecca had been trying to communicate through her silence, that her refusal to speak was terror, not impairment, that returning her to the Sullivan house was a death sentence. Rebecca disappeared 3 months later. Constance explained she had been placed with a family in Pennsylvania. Crawford located the official who had investigated the 1832 complaint. The man, deeply religious and eager to believe in the Sullivans' charitable work, had written a report praising their care of special needs children. He had documented Rebecca's good physical condition. He had noted the clean, well-organized household. He had never asked to see the basement. Crawford returned to the Sullivan farm on March 3, 1834, with 2 deputies and a warrant authorizing search of the entire property based on suspicion of unlawful imprisonment. Constance Sullivan opened the door, read the warrant, and her face became a mask. She asked to speak with her husband. Crawford agreed. Constance walked toward the barn where Ezra was working. The deputies followed at a distance. What happened next would be debated in newspapers for months. Some claimed Constance was trying to warn Ezra to flee. Others suggested she was attempting to destroy evidence. What's documented is that Constance stopped halfway between house and barn, stood absolutely still for 10 seconds, then returned to where Crawford waited. She spoke 3 sentences, each one delivered in that soft voice neighbors had trusted for 23 years. "You'll need help carrying them up. Some can walk, most can't." Then she walked into the house, descended into the basement, and began unlocking doors. The children found in the Sullivan basement ranged in age from 6 to 16, 47 total, 23 girls, 24 boys. Some had been there for over a decade, some for less than a year. All of them bore evidence of long-term imprisonment and systematic abuse. The children were chained to walls using iron cuffs attached to bolts driven into bedrock. The chains allowed them to move within their designated chambers, but prevented them from reaching the doors. They slept on straw mattresses placed directly on stone floors. They had buckets for waste, emptied once daily. They received 2 meals per day, sufficient for survival but calculated to keep them compliant through hunger. The chambers had no natural light. Oil lamps were lit only during working hours and only in sections where children were performing tasks. Most of the children had been in darkness so long their eyes had difficulty adjusting when they were brought upstairs. Sheriff Crawford's official report, preserved in the Henrico County Archives, described the scene with unusual emotion for a legal document. He wrote that 3 of his deputies resigned within a week, unable to reconcile what they had seen with their understanding of human nature. The oldest child found in the basement was 16-year-old Rebecca, the same girl who had been investigated and returned to the Sullivans' custody in 1832. She had been there since age 7, 9 years in darkness. 9 years of systematic deprivation calculated to break her will while keeping her alive enough to work. When deputies brought her upstairs into daylight, Rebecca collapsed. Not from physical weakness, though she was severely malnourished. She collapsed from terror, because in 9 years, the only times she had been brought upstairs were for punishment. It took 3 days before Rebecca would speak. When she did, her testimony would be crucial in understanding the full scope of the Sullivan operation. She told investigators about the punishment room, about the systematic brutality disguised as discipline, about the children who had died and been buried somewhere on the property, about the ones who had been sold and vanished into labor systems across multiple states. She told them about Mother Sullivan's ledger. The ledger was found hidden beneath the kitchen floor, exactly where Rebecca said it would be. It documented 23 years of systematic child trafficking, names, ages, costs, work assignments, and dispositions. Some entries were marked placed with dates and locations. Some were marked disposed with no additional information. Some were marked deceased with brief notations about cause of death, pneumonia, infection, accident, suicide. The ledger listed 163 children who had passed through the Sullivan operation since 1811. Only 47 were still alive in the basement when Sheriff Crawford arrived on March 3, 1834. The discovery at the Sullivan farm triggered an investigation that expanded across 6 states and involved federal authorities. Within days, news of the case spread through newspapers from Virginia to Maine. The public response was immediate and violent. Crowds gathered outside the Henrico County Jail, where Constance and Ezra Sullivan were held, demanding immediate execution. Sheriff Crawford, aware that mob justice would prevent proper investigation of the full network, arranged for the Sullivans to be transferred to the state penitentiary in Richmond. Even there, special security was required to prevent other prisoners from killing them. Constance Sullivan never expressed remorse. During weeks of interrogation, she maintained that she had provided the children with shelter, food, and purpose. She claimed she was rescuing them from poverty, abuse, and abandonment. When confronted with evidence of the brutal conditions in the basement, she explained that discipline was necessary to teach proper behavior. When asked about children who had died, she stated calmly that mortality rates were high in that era, and she had done her best with limited resources. When asked about children who had been sold, she corrected the terminology. She had placed them in situations where their labor could be properly utilized. The interrogators, hardened men who had investigated violent crimes for years, found themselves disturbed not by Constance's actions alone, but by her absolute conviction that she had done nothing wrong. She had created a complete moral framework in which she was the benefactor, and the children were recipients of her charity. The fact that she had profited substantially from their labor was, in her view, simply fair compensation for the care she provided. Ezra Sullivan was less coherent. He alternated between blaming his wife and claiming he had been trying to help the children. He insisted he had been building the basement to give them safe, secure housing. He couldn't explain why safe housing required chains. He couldn't explain why the children had been kept in darkness, Under sustained questioning, his explanations dissolved into incoherence. The trial began in June 1834 and lasted 3 weeks. It was one of the most extensively documented legal proceedings in American history to that point. Reporters from newspapers across the country attended. The courtroom was packed daily with citizens who waited hours for the chance to witness justice being served. Pause here and ask yourself, what would you have done if you were a neighbor who had accepted Constance Sullivan's explanations for 20 years? Would you have questioned more? Or would you have been just as convinced by her respectable appearance? Tell me in the comments what you think the real warning signs were that everyone missed. Rebecca testified for 6 hours over 2 days. She described in detail how the operation functioned, how children were acquired, processed, controlled, and ultimately disposed of. She identified Constance as the architect of the system and Ezra as the enforcer who carried out physical punishment when necessary. Her testimony was devastating because it was delivered without emotion. 9 years in the Sullivan basement had taught Rebecca that emotion was dangerous. She spoke in the same flat, mechanical tone she had learned to use when reporting to Mother Sullivan. She answered every question directly. She provided specific dates, names, and locations. Defense attorneys tried to discredit her testimony by suggesting she was mentally impaired or coached by prosecutors. But under cross-examination, Rebecca's account remained consistent in every detail. She knew things about the operation that could only be known by someone who had lived through it. Other children testified as well. Though most were too young or too traumatized to provide useful testimony, the younger ones simply confirmed that they had been held against their will. Several couldn't remember their original names or where they had come from. One 8-year-old girl, when asked to identify Constance Sullivan, walked directly to her and said 3 words, "That's my mother." The girl believed it. 4 years in captivity had erased everything that came before. The evidence beyond testimony was overwhelming. The ledger documented criminal conspiracy. The basement itself was physical proof of systematic imprisonment. Financial records showed profits that couldn't be explained by the farm's legitimate agricultural production. Investigators also found correspondence, letters between Constance and her contacts in multiple cities. The letters used coded language, but were transparent enough once decoded. Available inventory meant children for sale. New arrivals meant recently acquired children. Processing meant the period of brutal conditioning designed to break resistance. The letters revealed that the Sullivan operation was part of a larger network. Other similar operations existed. Other people were trafficking children across state lines. The Sullivan farm was profitable, but it was just one node in a much larger system of exploitation. Federal authorities used the correspondence to launch additional investigations. Over the following 3 years, 17 other trafficking operations were exposed and shut down. Hundreds more children were recovered. Dozens of perpetrators were arrested and prosecuted. But the Sullivan case remained the most horrific because of its scale, duration, and the systematic nature of the abuse. The jury deliberated for 90 minutes. They returned guilty verdicts on all counts: kidnapping, false imprisonment, forced labor, child abuse, and multiple counts of manslaughter related to children who had died in the Sullivans' custody. The judge, in his sentencing statement, called the Sullivan operation an abomination that strikes at the very heart of human decency. He noted that the systematic nature of the crimes, the long duration, and the absolute lack of remorse demonstrated by the defendants required the maximum penalty available under Virginia law. Constance and Ezra Sullivan were sentenced to death by hanging. The sentence was carried out on September 15, 1834, before a crowd of over 2,000 people who had traveled to Richmond to witness the execution. Constance Sullivan's last words, spoken from the scaffold, were, "I gave them shelter." She believed it until the end. The 47 children rescued from the Sullivan basement faced the difficult process of recovery. Most had no families to return to. Some families were located but refused to take back children they had either sold or given up years earlier. Others couldn't be identified because they didn't remember their original names or their families couldn't be traced. A special fund was established using money seized from the Sullivan estate. The fund paid for care, medical treatment, and education for the surviving children. Churches and charitable organizations across Virginia competed to demonstrate their commitment to child welfare by offering to house and care for Sullivan survivors. The irony wasn't lost on investigators. The same community that had ignored obvious signs of abuse for 20 years was now falling over itself to appear compassionate. Rebecca, at 18, was one of the oldest survivors and became something of a symbol for the case. She gave numerous interviews to newspaper reporters. She spoke at public events advocating for child protection laws. She worked with investigators to identify other trafficking operations, but she never fully recovered. Years later, people who knew Rebecca reported that she never slept in complete darkness. She never ate a full meal without leaving something on her plate. She never raised her voice above a whisper. The 9 years in the Sullivan basement had shaped her so completely that she couldn't unlearn the survival behaviors that had kept her alive. She died in 1867 at age 53, having spent her adult life advocating for children trapped in situations similar to her own. Her obituary in the Richmond newspaper noted that she had saved countless children through her advocacy work. It didn't mention that she had never married, never had children of her own, and lived alone in a small house where she kept every lamp burning throughout the night. The other children's fates varied. Some managed to build relatively normal lives with extensive support. They married, had families, found work, but all of them carried scars. Physical scars from chains and punishment, psychological scars from years of systematic trauma. The Sullivan survivors formed a network, staying in contact throughout their lives, connected by shared experience no one else could fully understand. The youngest children fared somewhat better because they had fewer memories of life before the basement. They were adopted by families and raised with love and care. Some went on to successful lives, but even decades later, certain triggers, sounds of chains, darkness, confined spaces, would send them back to those basement chambers. One survivor, taken at age 4 and rescued at age 10, became a teacher. She spent 40 years educating children in rural Virginia. When she retired in 1875, she told a reporter that she had dedicated her life to education because Mother Sullivan had taught her to read in the basement, and that skill had been the one thing that kept her mind intact during 6 years of imprisonment. Even in recovery, the Sullivan children couldn't escape what had been done to them. The Sullivan case fundamentally changed how America viewed child welfare. Before 1834, children were largely considered the property of whoever controlled them. Parents, employers, supposed guardians, had nearly unlimited authority over children in their care. The state rarely intervened. Child abuse was considered a private family matter. The Sullivan case shattered that assumption. Virginia passed the first comprehensive child protection laws in American history in 1835. The laws required government oversight of any institution or individual caring for more than 3 unrelated children. They mandated regular inspections. They established procedures for investigating complaints. They created penalties for anyone who physically abused children in their care. Other states quickly followed Virginia's model. By 1840, 30 states had passed similar legislation. The federal government addressed interstate trafficking with new laws, giving federal marshals authority to investigate and prosecute crimes that crossed state boundaries. The reforms weren't perfect. They were inconsistently enforced, but they represented a fundamental shift in how society understood its obligation to protect vulnerable children. Dr. Marcus Whitfield, the physician who had unknowingly enabled the Sullivan operation through his medical consultations, dedicated his remaining years to child welfare. He established free clinics specifically for orphaned and abandoned children. He trained other physicians in recognizing signs of abuse. He wrote extensively about medical ethics and the obligation of professionals to investigate suspicious situations rather than accepting convenient explanations. His 1842 treatise on the physician's duty to child patients became required reading in medical schools across the country. In it, he described his experience with the Sullivan case and his devastating realization that his desire to believe in human goodness had made him complicit in systematic abuse. He wrote, "We must learn to be suspicious of virtue that requires darkness to function. True charity welcomes investigation. Only exploitation demands privacy." Sheriff Benjamin Crawford was promoted to federal marshal. He spent the rest of his career specializing in crimes against children. He developed investigative techniques that would be used for decades: systematic record-keeping, coordination between jurisdictions, psychological evaluation of victims, and financial analysis to trace trafficking networks. His detailed reports on the Sullivan case became training material for law enforcement nationwide. He personally trained hundreds of officers in recognizing and investigating child exploitation. When he died in 1859, his funeral was attended by survivors of trafficking operations he had shut down across 10 states. The residents of Millbrook struggled with collective guilt. How had they lived for 20 years next to one of the most horrific crime scenes in American history without seeing it? What signs had they missed? What questions should they have asked? The community discussions that followed the Sullivan case changed how Americans thought about neighborly obligation. The romantic notion of privacy and respect for others, business, was replaced by a more realistic understanding that sometimes intervention was necessary. Communities began establishing informal watch systems where neighbors looked out for each other's children, where unusual situations were investigated rather than politely ignored. The Sullivan case also changed how institutions operated. Orphanages, poorhouses, and charitable organizations faced new scrutiny. Those that had operated with minimal oversight and corrupt administrators were forced to reform or shut down. Record-keeping became mandatory. Regular inspections became standard. The phrase "another Sullivan case" entered common usage as a warning about the potential for abuse in situations involving vulnerable children. But the most profound legacy of the Sullivan case was something more subtle. It forced Americans to confront a truth they had preferred to ignore, that evil didn't always look like evil, that monsters could be your neighbors, that respectability was a costume anyone could wear. The Sullivan farm itself became a symbol of this uncomfortable reality. The property was seized by the government and eventually sold at auction, but no one wanted to live in a place associated with such horror. The house stood empty for years. Vandals and curiosity seekers broke in, looking for artifacts of the horror that had occurred there. The basement became a particular focus of morbid curiosity. People would descend into the darkness, touching the walls where children had been chained, trying to imagine what those years had been like. Some claimed they could feel the suffering that had soaked into the stone. The property owner finally ordered the house demolished in 1845. The basement was filled with concrete and sealed permanently. A small cemetery was established on the site to memorialize the children who had died there, though most of their names were never known. A simple marker was erected with an inscription that read, "Here lie the innocents. May we never again mistake cruelty for charity." By 1850, the Sullivan farm had been reclaimed by forest. Trees grew where the house had stood. Undergrowth covered the filled basement. Only the cemetery remained visible, maintained by a local church group that tended the graves every spring. But the Sullivan case lived on in legal precedent, in child protection systems, and in the careful attention communities paid to anyone who claimed to be helping children. The case had demonstrated that systematic evil could flourish in apparently normal communities, and that vigilance was the price of preventing its return. The correspondence found in the Sullivan basement provided information that led to investigations for years afterward, letters containing references to other operations, other victims, other perpetrators. Some leads resulted in successful prosecutions, others led to dead ends. Some networks were so well hidden or so long disbanded that justice was impossible. One letter, found in a hidden compartment during the final search of the Sullivan property in 1835, was particularly disturbing. It was dated 1833, just a year before the discovery, and came from a contact in Boston. The letter referenced new inventory arriving from overseas and discussed the profitability of foreign acquisitions. Investigators realized that the Sullivan operation had been expanding, that Constance had been making arrangements to traffic children from international sources. If the foundation hadn't cracked that February night in 1834, if William Hutchinson hadn't noticed the collapse, if Sheriff Crawford hadn't trusted his instincts, the operation would have continued growing. How many more children would have been imprisoned? How many more years would the horror have continued? These questions haunted everyone involved in the investigation. The case also revealed the role of financial systems in enabling trafficking. Banks had accepted the Sullivans' deposits without question. Merchants had sold them supplies in quantities that should have raised concerns. Lawyers had processed property transactions without investigating the source of funds. In response, Virginia passed additional regulations requiring financial institutions to report suspicious transactions. The regulations were primitive by modern standards and easily circumvented, but they represented the first attempt to use financial oversight as a tool against organized crime. The Sullivan case became a touchstone for later reform movements. Abolitionists used it as evidence that slavery wasn't the only form of systematic human exploitation in America. Child labor reformers cited it when arguing for restrictions on employment of minors. Prison reformers pointed to it when discussing the need for oversight of custodial institutions. The case appeared in sermons as an example of how evil could hide behind Christian rhetoric. It appeared in political speeches as evidence of the need for federal involvement in crimes that crossed state lines. It appeared in newspaper editorials whenever another case of child abuse was discovered. And there were other cases. The Sullivan investigation had exposed just how common child trafficking was in 1830s America. Poor record-keeping, high mobility, and minimal government oversight created conditions where children could disappear with minimal consequences for those responsible. The Sullivan case didn't end child exploitation, but it made exploitation harder. It created systems of accountability that hadn't existed before. It forced communities to acknowledge their obligation to protect vulnerable members. If this investigation into one of history's most systematic horrors has left you shaken, you're not alone. These are the stories we need to remember because forgetting them means we're doomed to repeat them. Subscribe to this channel and hit that notification bell because next week we're uncovering another buried sin that demanded payment across generations. Share this with someone who understands that the darkest truths deserve to be told. The past has more secrets to reveal, and we're here to dig them all up. Rebecca's advocacy work in the decades following her rescue became increasingly focused on a specific message: believe children. She argued that the Sullivan operation had continued for over 20 years, primarily because adults refused to believe that respectable people could commit such crimes. Every time a child tried to signal distress, every time behavior suggested something was wrong, adults found reasons to dismiss their concerns. Children who seemed unusually quiet were shy. Children who flinched from touch were traumatized by earlier losses. Children who wouldn't speak were mentally impaired. Every abnormal behavior was explained away rather than investigated. Rebecca spent years training teachers, social workers, and law enforcement officers in recognizing signs of abuse. She developed checklists of behavioral indicators. She advocated for mandatory reporting laws that would require adults to report suspected abuse, rather than leaving it to individual judgment. Many of her reforms wouldn't be implemented until the 20th century, but she planted seeds that would eventually grow into modern child protection systems. When Rebecca died in 1867, she left behind a written account of her 9 years in the Sullivan basement. The manuscript, preserved in the Virginia Historical Society archives, provides the most detailed survivor testimony of the operation. It's difficult to read. The clinical, emotionless tone makes the horror more vivid, not less. Rebecca describes daily routines in detail. Wake at 5, waste buckets emptied, bread and water for breakfast, work assignments given, labor until evening, thin stew for dinner, sleep on straw mattresses, repeat. The monotony was part of the torture, the same degrading routine, day after day, year after year, designed to break any hope of change. She describes the punishment system. Minor infractions resulted in reduced food rations. More serious violations meant time in the punishment room. Attempts to escape or rebellion meant beatings that left permanent scars. She describes the psychological warfare. Mother Sullivan's particular cruelty was convincing children that their imprisonment was their own fault, that they were being punished for sins they had committed, that if they just behaved properly, they would eventually be released. Children, desperate to believe that suffering would end, eventually convinced themselves that Mother Sullivan was right, that they deserved their punishment, that compliance would lead to freedom. It never did. Rebecca's manuscript ends with a question that echoes across generations. How many others are still in darkness? How many Mother Sullivans are still operating? How many communities are still choosing to believe comfortable lies rather than uncomfortable truths? The question remains relevant nearly 2 centuries later. The Sullivan case exposed one operation in 1834, but systematic child exploitation didn't end with Constance Sullivan's execution. It adapted. It found new forms. It continued in darkness wherever people were willing to look away. The Sullivan case stands as a warning, not just about the capacity for individual evil, but about the collective responsibility communities bear for protecting vulnerable members. Every person in Millbrook who accepted Constance Sullivan's explanations without investigation bore some responsibility for allowing the horror to continue. Not legal responsibility. Most of them had no reason to suspect what was happening, but moral responsibility for creating an environment where systematic evil could operate openly because everyone chose comfort over curiosity. The Sullivan basement was sealed in 1845, but metaphorical basements still exist wherever adults choose to believe convenient lies rather than investigate uncomfortable truths. Wherever communities prioritize the reputation of respectable citizens over the safety of vulnerable children, wherever systems fail because people assume someone else is paying attention. The sins of Constance and Ezra Sullivan were their own, but the sin of Millbrook was collective. 20 years of polite silence, 20 years of accepting explanations, 20 years of choosing not to see what should have been obvious. That collective sin, that choice to value comfort over truth, is the real legacy of the Sullivan case, because it's a choice communities still face. It's a choice individuals still make when confronted with signs that something might be wrong, but investigating would be uncomfortable. The children in the Sullivan basement couldn't scream loud enough to be heard through stone walls and layers of earth, but children today can scream. They can signal distress in dozens of ways. The question is whether adults are willing to hear, whether communities are willing to investigate, whether we've learned anything from the horror of 1834. The Sullivan case suggests the answer is complicated. We've built systems. We've passed laws. We've created institutions designed to protect children, but systems only work when people use them. Laws only matter when they're enforced. Institutions only protect when they're properly funded and staffed. And underneath all the structures we've built, the fundamental question remains the same. Are we willing to look closely at respectability? Are we willing to question people who seem charitable? Are we willing to investigate even when investigation is uncomfortable? Because evil doesn't announce itself. It wears costumes, it speaks softly, it quotes scripture. It appears in white clapboard farmhouses in respectable communities. It looks like your neighbor. That's what Constance Sullivan taught us. That's the sin that refuses to stay buried. Not her individual monstrosity, which was extraordinary, but the ordinary human tendency to believe what's comfortable rather than investigate what's true. The 47 children found chained in that basement in March 1834 were freed. But how many weren't? How many died before rescue came? How many were sold and lost to history? How many are still trapped in modern equivalents, waiting for someone to care enough to look closely? These are the questions the Sullivan case forces us to confront. These are the sins that demand payment across generations, not just the sins of perpetrators, but the sins of those who chose not to see, who valued comfort over truth, who believed appearances over evidence. The Sullivan basement is sealed, but the lesson remains open. The debt remains unpaid. And every time a community chooses convenience over investigation, every time respectability outweighs curiosity, every time we decide that our neighbors couldn't possibly be monsters, we risk creating another Sullivan farm. Another place where children scream in darkness while the world above goes about its business, confident that evil always announces itself, that monsters always look like monsters, that horror always comes with clear warning signs. The Sullivan case proves otherwise. And that truth, uncomfortable as it is, might be the most important lesson history has to teach.